Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today's webinar, Growth Interrupted, Navigating COVID's Shock to Canada's Tourism Workforce, will be about 1 hour. Thank you for joining us. My name is Philip Mondor. I'm President and CEO of Tourism HR Canada, and I will serve as today's narrator for the session. This is a recorded webinar, and it will also be available to anyone who chooses to review it, along with a PDF that you can download from our website following the session. If you've got questions along the way, I encourage you to use the Q&A session on the bar or the chat function. We have staff who are monitoring those questions. It's possible we will not be able to get to all of those along the way, but we will include the answers to anything we do not cover as part of the follow-up that will be included in the downloadable PDF. Today's session has a lot of data slides and charts. They're fairly intensive in some places, and we know it's not always going to be easy to follow all the detail, but not to worry. We've been selected on the data, and the key point here is to get across some major messages, to also help you understand the types of programs and services that are available to help respond and where you can get more information. With the downloadable PDF, you'll get a chance to look at this in more detail. Now, I've chosen not to share my video just to make sure that the screen is clear. And besides, I'm not much to look at anyway. Everything I'm about to present here today is also available on our website in different forms. So with that, we will get started into the actual content. In February of this year, the tourism sector had just over 2 million workers. Within 10 weeks, in April, we were able to identify a loss of 881,000 workers due to COVID. This was about 45% of the workforce that was displaced. And for interest, that represented about 30% of the Canadian workforce that were affected. So Canada lost almost 2 million jobs during the month of April itself, which was a record high. And according to Statistics Canada's labor force survey data, the total number of jobs lost during the crisis was more than 3 million. As you can see, the tourism sector represented a very large portion, and today continues to. By August, the most recent data we have to work with, we are still short 463,500 workers compared to what we had last August. So in February, we had just over 2 million. By April, we had 1.5 million. In August, we had 1.7 million. Quite a change over previous years. The data that I'm using for this comes from our labor force survey data. It's monthly information we collect and translate into meaningful charts and analysis. It's under the Tourism HR Canada's employment tracker tool, which is on our website. So that information just supplied to you comes from this chart as an example. It's something you'll be able to access from our website at any point, and I'll explain more about that option as I go further along in the presentation. Let's look at this from a slightly different perspective. Using the same data, this diagram helps illustrate the difference or the gap from 2019 compared to what we've seen in 2020. You will notice that in February, just prior to the World Health Organization's declaration of COVID-19 as a pandemic and the shuttering of businesses, tourism was on a growth trajectory, with anticipated records for the season, both in terms of revenues and job growth numbers. Let's look at this one more time to get a clear idea of the impact of the pandemic on labor in the Canadian tourism workforce. In February, there were just over 2 million workers. By April, about 10 weeks into COVID, there was a loss of 881,700 workers. These displaced workers accounted for nearly 1/3 of all of those Canadians who lost jobs during that period. By August, we had a gain of about 572,000 jobs. So tourism businesses made great efforts to call back or rehire new people to fill jobs during our peak season. This coincided with the Government of Canada's relief measures, which were very helpful. But still, with restrictions on travel for international visitors, on service options and more, some of which I'll touch on later, the sector was far short of its potential. In terms of employment, there were 463,500 fewer workers than we had last year at the same time. And in terms of displaced workers, nearly 310,000 people never returned to work. Many who were employed since April have had reduced hours and continues to face uncertainty about their jobs. In some sectors, actual hours worked have returned to pre-COVID levels. But despite increases in April, most sectors were still reporting that the total number of hours worked by all employees remained below levels seen in February, or below levels seen in July. Accommodation and food service employees worked more hours compared to the other sections of the industry. I'll be talking about projections later in the presentation as we expect the winter months themselves will show a continued decline in the number of workers as we move into 2021. The levels will remain depressed. In May, just to put a more of a perspective on this, one more slide here. In May, the Statistics Canada reported that unemployment rates soared to 13%. So the Canadian economy's unemployment rate was at 13%. Tourism, on the other hand, was at 29.7%. And the number of people employed in tourism sector at the time was 41% lower than in May of 2019. Each of the tourism industries were impacted, some more than others. In May, tourism's unemployment rate was more than double of the Canadian labor market overall. And if you look at current numbers, which I don't have to demonstrate, to display today, they remain at about double the rate of the Canadian labor market overall. The sectors that made a little gain over the summer were both food and service and accommodation. The key message here, as you've heard before and in recent media, is that the sector was hit early and it was among the hardest hit. If we look pre-COVID for a moment, in fact, luckily in a sort of strange way, we had our annual labor market forum 1 week before COVID was officially announced by the World Health Organization, and for which the Government of Canada began to do some shuttering of industry. At the Labor Market Forum, there was a lot of discussion about some key challenges we continued to face. Fundamentally, it was around chronic shortage of workers. In fact, it was at its lowest than we've had in 40 years, and our growth trajectory was beyond the numbers that we could find to work in our sector. There were indeed other issues other than the supply. We understood that we were falling short on different skill demands, and we were looking for more support around improved worker and labor mobility or learning mobility. All three of these dimensions, supply, skills, and mobility, were hampering our growth, and it was starting to impact Canada's ability to compete for international visitors. What we discover as we come a little out of the recovery side of this, and it's still a long way to go, we know that we're going to continue to face some of these persistent challenges, but in different ways. As we walk through today's presentation, I'll try to illustrate a few of those examples. Also pre-COVID, many of you would know that the 1.8 million was the number that we strongly used to talk about the number of workers in the sector. Here, in this slide, you can see that the percentage by tourism industry. So travel services only had 2% of our workforce, whereas food and beverage about 52%. Now, the 1.8 million number comes from the 2016 census, which is the most recent number we have for full year that was available from Stats Canada. What we've been working with since then, because it's more timely and up-to-date information, is labor force surveys. These are done monthly, and what we know is that come February, we were actually just over 2 million. It's a number, in fact, we were just about to publish before COVID started. Dealing with the COVID crisis is new to everyone. The pandemic hit, and it was a quick and massive blow to the sector. We had to scramble to look at how we could help address the 881,000 workers that were displaced and the crisis faced by employers in grappling with the workforce issues. We started by looking at how this was being addressed elsewhere and what research tells us from other economic or catastrophic recovery efforts. This informed a lot of our strategy moving forward, the subject of today's webinar. A sad note, yesterday marked the 200th day since the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 as a pandemic. To date, there have been over 33 million cases worldwide, and sadly, just over 1 million deaths. In recent weeks, the resurgence or new spikes are occurring in several countries. Russia, Brazil, the UK, the US are among those accounting for the largest number of cases. This, of course, is going to mean that international tourism and indeed even our own domestic tourism will be impacted for some time. As many, if not all of you know, the US visitor market is one of our most important markets. And given the nature of the COVID scenario, that is illustrating how it will be some time before we can rely on one of the most trusted markets. So COVID will be with us for some time to come, and no one is sure just how long. We first started to find the words hardest hit sector sometime around May. I found this report from McKinsey, which dates to June. And in here is the first time we see some of the words hardest hit. I know this graph is too much detail to find or to see, but the key message here is that tourism, which is basically represented by, most of it represented by the top two categories of industries listed, are among those hardest hit. And indeed, you can see that the recovery for many of us will not happen until late 2024 into 2025. Of course, that's based on a number of assumptions and with the view that travel will start to commence in advance. Just bringing this to another perspective or context, if you want to reinforce that the message that the sector has been direly impacted, this Stats Canada summary of job losses by industry shows some more comparisons. Tourism jobs, which are reflected primarily by the food service and accommodation and the information, culture, and recreation category, you can see how they track high. We actually have a share of jobs in transportation and warehousing and a minuscule number within the fishing category there. Bottom line though, we do track amongst the highest of all industries in Canada in terms of hardest hit. Many of you will know this slide. This is an adapted slide from Destination Canada recently reported, which of course talks about an unprecedented collapse. This data is taken from Stats Canada's Frontier Counts. Frontier Counts concern the number of international travelers by selected category and by type of transportation, as well as the number of automobiles, trucks, and other vehicles entering Canada. The diagram is a general summary. In the past 4 years, the visitor growth trajectory has also been one of the strongest periods since 1972, which makes the collapse even more acute. To put this in perspective, a brief note about SARS. This is the last example of a coronavirus that's still memorable for many of us. So SARS, as many of you know, is the severe acute respiratory syndrome. And it was in December 31, 2003 that the WHO, World Health Organization, received reports of about 8,100 probable cases and about 775 deaths. Became known as SARS, and the first documented case was actually in November of 2002. As it turns out, eventually Canada had about 251 probable cases and 44 deaths. Quite a different scenario than we see today in many ways. It had an impact then. We used to think of this as a crisis, as we did 9/11, as we did the financial crisis, and other events along the way. But as you can see from the diagram, they all pale by comparison of what we're facing with COVID. So let me move now a little bit into what we mean by disruption. Although I'm going to focus on the workforce, you're going to see a lot of data related to economic variables at the same time, as these go hand in hand. And just as a reminder to everyone, our website includes, under the research tab, something referred to as Employer Tracker. It basically does contain, month by month, all of the data we've been collecting and summarizing on your behalf to show exactly what the trends have been by sector, by province, by occupational areas, and so on. Even with the recovery of jobs, the sector was only 75% of what it was last year in July, as one example. But I'm going to show you a number of slides here and walk you through a bit of the examples of what it looked like by province for a moment. Now, granted, I don't want to overload you with so much data. I'm going to highlight a few things as I walk through this. And of course, this information is available in lots of detail on the website itself. So let's start in the west and work our way east. This is what the trajectory looks like for British Columbia. The red line is the 2019 marker of where employment where it was, and the 2020 shows you how employment tracked over the COVID period to date. We don't yet have September data, but as soon as we do, it will be added, as it will be moving forward for any other subsequent months. What does this mean in hard numbers? Well, by April, BC lost approximately 158,500 jobs in the sector. And by August, they're still short by about 40,000 jobs of what they were last year. Moving into September, October, and the fall season, we expect that those numbers will continue to go down. In other words, the unemployment numbers will go up. So basically, British Columbia was hit by about a 49% loss of its workforce in those first 10 weeks. If we look at Alberta, similar idea, and their loss was 47% in the same period. They too remained short compared to last year at a higher percentage. If you look at Saskatchewan, the loss was about 42% of their workforce in those first 10 weeks. Again, this is from February to April. And they're still 20,000 short of the workers they had by August of last year, compared to August of last year. Manitoba's was 41% short by April. These numbers, of course, are alarming. They should send off all kinds of bells for people, acknowledging that this is a very hard hit, very difficult to grapple with, unprecedented. Ontario, much larger scale of industry, still 41% loss of workers. The type of workers we're talking about here are of all types: frontline, management, executive. Indeed, some places did not even open. So it includes entrepreneurs and anyone else you can think of in the sector. In terms of Quebec, the loss was 42%. If we look at New Brunswick, the loss was 37%. Nova Scotia, 50%. Incidentally, moving forward into the fall, we anticipate that the Atlantic region will actually have higher impacts, higher numbers of losses than other regions of Canada. Prince Edward Island, the losses accounted for 53%. And in Newfoundland and Labrador, the losses accounted for 29%. That number will go up significantly as we head into the fall. Unfortunately, we do not have data for the North just yet. When we do, we will certainly be putting it out there, and we will alert our friends in the North once that's available. Looking at our data from another perspective for a moment, I've also just sliced it to show you what it means by industry. First of all, the sector overall. As we said in April, there was a loss of 881,000. Well, what did that mean for food and beverage services? They took the disproportionate portion of that. They had a loss of 487,000. Now, a little side note here. For those that are familiar with Restaurants Canada's data, their number will still be higher, which is appropriate because Restaurants Canada also represents a slightly larger constituency, and they would have numbers inclusive of people working in institutions like hospitals, for example, where they would count some of the culinary people and things like that. But if we look at it from our tourism perspective, the loss number we would have is 487,700 for the food and beverage services sector. Moving along the trajectory, accommodation, a loss of 78,200 jobs. So those two industries within our sector accounted for the largest proportion of people that were impacted, the largest hits in relative terms. Moving forward, travel services accounted for 21,600 job losses by April. In transportation, 108,800. Airlines being a large proportion of these, as well as any transport that cross borders. And finally, on the last section, recreation and entertainment, we had a loss of 185,400 jobs. This is a curious sector for sure, this industry component. It's one where we were seeing the largest growth of jobs prior to COVID. And not surprising, moving forward, there'll be new complications with this industry, which is quite diverse. Now, I'm not showing you a lot of other data points here. I could have showed you the August information or any of the other trajectories on here, but this is more to give you a flavor for the kinds of information you can collect and extract directly from the website, all at no cost. And you can do this by province or by industry, by time period, and even at an occupational level. Okay, so what did that look like overall to the sector? Of the 881,000 jobs that were lost by April, this is the share of how it broke down. Again, food and beverage had really accounted for the largest proportion, but in relative terms, it's about proportionate to the nature of the sector itself. In other words, although they had 55% of the share of job loss, they also represented about 51% of the workforce overall. And this is generally true of the other categories. Now, let's look at a few more indicators here. I mean, just last week, the Government of Canada's speech from the throne on Wednesday announced that further support for industries have been hardest hit, including travel and tourism. A little shout out here to our colleagues at HAC, that's Susie Granol and TIAC, Charlotte Bell, who led the charge on the hardest hit campaign. On the day this was announced, Mike McNanny, president of the National Airlines Council of Canada, said that the federal authorities need to take immediate and concrete plans to support the sector. He indicated that in Canada, passenger numbers are down 94% from 2019. And aviation, as we would expect, was still at a stage 0 in its recovery cycle. According to the International Air Transport Association, Canada's airline revenues in 2020 fell by 14.6 billion, or 43% over last year. Air Canada announced just over the weekend that it is estimated to be at least 3 years before it reaches pre-pandemic travel levels. Now, between these the three largest airlines will be 27,000 employees that have been laid off since March. I spent a little time on this one for a reason. We all know that the industry relies heavily on travel and international visitors as one of our main staples. Well, this trajectory alone will give you a clue as to why some of our projections show recovery late in 24 and 25. Until the airline passengers are able to travel more freely and borders are open and vaccines are basically helping address some of the issues globally, this is going to be a suppressed situation and a very slow recovery. Again, that's why we can argue we're hardest hit, but we'll also be one of the slowest on recovery. Another slide I've included in here just for information looks at the same data, but from a global perspective instead. And in fact, if you look at this a little more detail, Canada appears to be a little more harder hit than than generally speaking in the airline industry. So that's important to know if we're looking at our own context and the challenges ahead. Incidentally, all data sources that I'm talking about are quoted on each one of our respective slides. So when you do download the presentation, if you want to know precisely where the data's been, what the source was, it's always in the bottom corner and you can go and collect it. Another indicator I want to draw attention to is occupancy rates. Here we go to STR data, and we're showing here the trajectory of the occupancy rates for 2020. Now they don't have data that goes back prior to that week in June, but this is how occupancy rates compared to 2019 for the peak season period. Roughly half or less of the rates that we had previously. And that's pretty alarming when you think that in April, hotels were reporting occupancy rates of some as under 10%, but on average about 10 or 11%. You can imagine why they're struggling and why they're unable to keep their doors open. Food services, another indicator of the challenges and what actually occurred in terms of activity. This gives you an idea of the sales over this period. The dip obviously is consistent with what we saw with the labor dip and so on. Now, there is some recovery for food services in the summer months. They benefited a little bit more than the rest of the sector overall, but still the numbers are far short of what they were previous to COVID, approximately half. And that's only accounting for the types of businesses that were open. Sticking on the narrative a little bit of just revenues for a moment, a little fact here in our data, you'll discover that the sector's GDP by March of this year compared to last year dropped by 30%. In June, that got worse by 49%. We do have newer data coming out for August sometime in the near future, but it's equally bleak. And to really put this in perspective, how do we compare? Well, in March, the GDP average overall, the overall economy was only down by 5.8%, where this sector was down by 30.3%. Pretty scary. And again, our website will have more data points on other time frames, but it just shows you how difficult this is and what it means from an impact point of view. Now, this slide is directly a screenshot from the employment tracker. I pulled it up just to show you the same data that you saw now in previous slides, where I got it from, what it looks like. It's a sample. I don't want to belabor all this point, but this is the slide that shows GDP from all sources of the 14 tourism-related industries. So anyway, I'll leave it at that for now without getting too boring. To give you a little more illustration of this, broken down by the respective sectors, comparing March to June. So this is 2019 numbers over 2020 numbers. So you can see that for each of March and June, I'm just showing what it looked like in 2019 versus 2020. And I'm going to do this for a number of the different industries in tourism that we have data available. What's alarming here If I just use the marker of a decrease of more than 30% of GDP, that was that average number I talked about in March, previous slide, it shows you how many times in our industry, the industries were impacted. Remember that 30% average was where we were in tourism compared to the economy overall, which was a dip of about 5.8. Now, this is not even the grade slide. Watch this next one. This slide is the one that contains some of the sector's highest employed people, or the larger, where there's more businesses. And if I flag all of those that were more than 30%, it wins the prize. All but gambling in March managed to skirt being more than 30%. But I must say, there's no single time frame in COVID since March where the sector has not been gravely reduced in terms of its GDP or its earnings, way higher than the economy overall. Businesses are challenged, as we all know. Liquidity is a major concern, and I'm sure many of you are grappling with that. So moving forward a little bit now, I'm going to bring it back to the labor front. These are always kind of hand in hand. If you look at our current data and starting to think of some of the projections, what we know is that by 2025, tourism is able to fill about 1.94 jobs. So that's what we would see as the time frame by which we are returning to where we were in February or just prior to COVID. 5 years from now, we'll be back to the number where we were at the beginning of COVID some 200 days ago. What we also know about our data moving forward is that a number, almost all of the challenges we saw with labor pre-pandemic will persist. In fact, many will be amplified as we come out of this COVID situation. Actually, the challenges we're facing today in labor, some are unique and have compounded some of our problems. You will see in a slide coming up that even this past summer, 40% of the businesses we polled had trouble finding workers. That may seem a little bit odd or paradoxical, but when I get to that slide, I'll offer a little more insight. Pre-pandemic for a moment, these were the numbers we were broadcasting. These were sort of the shortfalls. We were looking at about 78,000 workers over the next 5 years, which we were not filling. And by the next 15 years, just short of 100,000 workers. And in terms of the jobs that we were talking about, they are all over the place. They are frontline, they are supervisory, they are executive, they are entrepreneurial, and there's quite a large distribution of the types of jobs that we are facing, have been facing shortages and will continue to face shortages. Some of the areas where we've had shortages have been on what Government of Canada refers to on demand list for more than 25 years. Cooks are one of those examples. Now, I'm not showing you all the occupations where we are struggling. Our data again shows you what they look like for all of our industries, and they rank them by the most difficult to fill right through to ones where there might be a surplus. Just a little hint there, there's only 2 that are on that list. But it shows you that we have a lot to come into grips with moving forward. It's more than trying to retain, but it's also about worrying about where we'll continue to have shortages. Now, what I've done here is just extract an example for one of the hardest hit industries in our sector, which is accommodation, without pulling out data for every one of them. I'm just showing you what our projections are moving forward for the accommodation sector. We go right through to 2025. What we also have is a little more of a breakdown for 2020, 2021, where you can look at it by quarter. So that's a little more specific. That specificity matters, of course, because it's the near future and there's a little more we can work with in terms of some level of reliance on it. Moving further out, There's more assumptions made with some of that data, and of course it'll adjust as time goes on. But that said, these numbers, if you compare them to where we were in 2019 and what the market needs, are going to be quite suppressed or depressed. We've also, just for the interest of those that always want to know what the impact is on the revenues based on the worker ratios or the shortages of workers, is how I like to put it sometimes. We have comparative data to tell you what that means in terms of the impact on revenues. Now, this is important data in so far as people want to, because we have a hard time filling the jobs we have, you know, there is basically lost revenues when you're not able to fill those shoes. And moving forward, we see those shortages looming and they're going to grow again. So it goes hand in hand. It speaks to some strategies we need to continue to focus on in terms of moving forward, even in pandemic times. Now, I've only gave you a little slice of some of those data points. Obviously, in a presentation of this type, there's only so many charts and numbers you want to look at or that you could technically digest. But it gives you a flavor for the kind of information you can get directly from the website today, in a moment, for free. You just have to go on site and grab it. Now, I want to also reflect a few more messages about some other kind of data that we've been collecting, more anecdotal rather than statistical. And the reason for this is it's also informing some of our strategies moving forward, or recommended policy areas to help us address our challenges. So we did an impact survey with the labor market that was in the last week of June into the first week of July. It was meant to be a benchmark survey. We chose that time very deliberately. It coincided with the moment when the federal government announced some type of relief funding. It was also just at a moment when industry was starting to open up for its business. And they were able to reflect on the impact of COVID in the first period of time before we would anticipate some growth because of our normal tourism season. This survey, a version of it, gets repeated again in about 10 weeks time from now, again in the early part of the next calendar year, and episodically thereafter, so that we can track some of the trends. There is this complete report available already for download on our website with all the different data points. For today, I've just selected a few slides for information to help build a bit of context on some policy points I want to raise. So when we did this survey, what we discovered was that about 60% of the respondents were open, but most had some level of restrictions. Indeed, they were open somewhere between 50 and 70% of their normal operations on average. I say on average because if you broke that down looking more at the hotels, for example, they were operating at a much, much lower percentage. Temporarily closed, many declared that at about 30%, and only 6.2% said they were fully opened. This is in the last week of June. When we asked them to compare their numbers from May of last year to this year and what they expected it to be in August, this is what we were told. So their numbers do track with the stats in terms of the May number being many fewer workers. And by the way, that had just recently got a bump at that point because they were anticipating some summer activity. And we're going to have the reflection of August to benefit from. This was based on what do you think your numbers will be in August. It turns out they were quite accurate with their projections. We will, of course, be extrapolating on this or have in that report, and there'll be more to come as we do the follow-up survey to compare the tracking of it. Now, here's the slide I was talking about earlier. When you look at the poll, we asked how many had difficulties finding workers for the summer. 41 or almost 42% said they were concerned about hiring employees, where 58% were not. In reality, many had very difficult time finding workers, and there were many reasons for that. I'll come to that in a few slides from now. But when we gave them a little more data to give us a little bit of an indication about why they thought so, this is how things ranked. Now, CERB had recently been announced. The wage subsidy had been raised. I mean, terms on it are a little bit different today than they were back in June, but they loomed as a concern for people highly. I can remember many calls I had in that window of time on this. CERB was an attractive program, but businesses felt that they couldn't compete with it, basically. At the rate that the subsidy was available, it didn't seem lucrative for people to return to work that was not necessarily stable, and there was a sense of precarity and so on. Now, I won't go through all these points, but they did rank fairly high, and they included with a number of other items. So there indeed are a lot of different challenges that they identified as barriers to finding workers this summer. This, by the way, translated into a piece of work we did to discover and learn more about the challenges themselves, because they were top of mind and preoccupied a fair amount of time in terms of requests by media outlets or associations, and indeed some governments, asking us to understand, to give some evidence or some understanding of why this problem was in place. We did an article on this. It was posted in one of our newsletters, still available on our blog site, which gives you a little more information. But I want to highlight a few things here. People are not returning to work for a variety of reasons. The challenges we see here are not limited to tourism. It is indicative of what we see in the workforce overall, although some of these perhaps are a little more of a concern to us or more acute to us. So a few examples. Unsafe workplace. This industry, as we all know, is very customer facing, very high contact points with what we do. And COVID being transmitted as the way it is, has made a lot of people very unsure and uncertain about going into workplaces for different reasons. And whether that's founded or not in terms of real concerns, it's enough to have many of them declare that they will choose not to work in this sector. By the way, we anticipate that that might go way beyond COVID times and taint a bit of the image of working in this sector. There's also, number two, came up very often, just the uncertainty about income. With the wage subsidies that were available, with CERB that was available, and sort of a, if you want to call it guaranteed income, they really felt that the risk of taking on a job with uncertainty about hours, or even if the workplaces might survive because the number of hours had been reduced substantially, trade was down, etc. Many felt that they could not take the risk of returning to work. Their odds were better to stay with CERB, as an example. The wage subsidy was late in arriving too, so it was less of a carrot to be able to draw people back, or less of an option for employers to help retain people, since it lagged in terms of its introduction. There's a lot of other challenges. You can expect that many of those are going to persist. They might be part of a high-risk group. So we're going to see a fall off of older populations in our workforce because they are choosing to retire as a result of this. We also know that from the younger side of the equation, as primary caregivers, whether it's for children or elderly parents or others that are in need, they may need to stay home. They may live with someone with high risk, for which they cannot take the risk of potentially getting COVID and bring it into the home. Public and mental health is skyrocketing. This is a new field of data we're getting information on. I'll speak to at the end of the presentation. Some don't want to return because the nature of work has changed dramatically. A curious one is that transportation is a concern to many because that exposure and transportation is just not comfortable for people and the options are not available, and so on. So you start adding this up and you can see why the challenge is there, was there in the summer, actually will become more difficult as we move forward. And as a recovery point, it's going to be the kind of stuff that we're going to have to learn to counter in our messages about tourism and tourism jobs, because many of these will be residual, stains that we have to operate with as views of something that's persistent. A quick note here that moving forward, we've been doing a fair amount of work on labor laws and the impacts of COVID. For today, I'm not going to speak to this in any length, but just to let you know that as we segue into some of the other research here, there's a lot of concern around legislation and employment law, mostly because the laws that have been in play for some time are not consistent with some of the demands in today's workforce, let alone in some of the phenomena that COVID has brought on. So it's created a real challenge and indeed possible liability issues for the sector. Again, tourism is not alone here, but just to give you an example here, the extension of layoff periods for temporary layoffs was increased across the board for up to 6 months, but that soon becomes an end, which could mean that as people have to start doing proper layoffs, that they can no longer rely on temporary layoffs as acceptable by law. So temporary measures are going to be a problem. They may simply not extend long enough. Rules on terminations and severance entitlements vary by province. They're adjusting them routinely. It's very difficult for employers to navigate these things. Termination and severance obligations can create a significant burden on the business. For example, we've done one little case study looking at this. A restaurant with 30 employees could be liable for payments amounting for about $100,000. So watch for more on this to come. We will be having an article on this in one of our upcoming editions of Tourism Insider, and we'll continue to offer more specific information on this on our website. I think we covered off this slide earlier. It just, thought it was good measure to include it twice. But the reason I included it there was to let you know that some of the other research we have, you can collect more detail or more specificity around it. So this is an example right from our website on more like the direct numbers from that data of the previous slide. Here's a trajectory of what our full employment would look like. Again, I'm going to stress that it's late 2024, early 2025 that we anticipate, with all of the sort of variables and assumptions we've made, that sector will finally look like what it did pre-COVID or February of this year. Our data would also tell us that if we look at it by quarter, again, I just wanted to show you that we do break this down by quarter in 2020, 2021. You can get a little more of a sense of the variability that will occur in that time frame. This, by the way, you can get by sector, by province as well. And to give you, this is way too much data to see, but it's lovely, it's colorful, right? So, the color is helpful. Even by province, it's going to show you what that looks like across each of the respective years moving forward. And again, that can be broken down by sector, etc. So basically the message here is go and find the employment tracker on our website. Now, with my last 10 minutes, I want to move a little bit into, so what are we doing about all this? What does it mean in terms of policy? How are we going to get our workforce back to work and ensure that we have the workers we need, not only to get through COVID and to cope with these very difficult situations that we're faced with, but indeed to make sure that we have a good core of people and those ready to go when recovery starts to happen, because we think rebound is going to be like an elastic. It's going to spring back quickly, but only if we have the workers to help build the return when we're able. That's a real tricky one though, because we're not comfortable or not confident that those workers will be there. Anyway, not to make this all so bleak, I want to give you a quick idea of how we started to look at this way back in April and a few things that we've done. We basically, after investigating the phenomena on how this is being addressed in countries and historically, came up with 4 primary areas to focus on. One was around worker retention, and on that, some prevailing themes emerged. One of the most important was that research tells us that online or training was most important to initiate rapidly, to make it accessible. This was about retention. This was about helping people gain the skills they need when they can, so that they can help with recovery. This is particularly skills required of owner-operators to navigate issues that are novel, especially with recovery matters. This was also acknowledging that it made a big difference with mental health. So that is an example of a piece of work that we did. We also contributed to some 15 or so articles in trade magazines on helping with retention and other matters. Our Tourism HR Insider newsletter, which comes out every second Wednesday, shifted entire focus on matters that helped with these sorts of issues. Like others, we include and continue to maintain a curated web presence on workforce matters so that you can get a one-stop shop to go and identify other resources from governments of Canada, provincial governments, associations, and others who have tools to help with dealing with workforce matters. As you saw from this presentation, and really at the heart of this presentation, a lot of the work we've been doing is around labor market research. This is a cornerstone of the mandate, but what we've done over COVID is really put a laser focus entirely on data specific to COVID. The employment tracker tool I've mentioned frequently. We've done labor market projections with the Conference Board of Canada. We've got some new methodology there that we're quite excited by, which is what the numbers are based on in this presentation. Much more to come on that in future editions of the newsletter. And if you didn't catch last Wednesday's newsletter, you would have seen some of those numbers. We've also been collecting information on consumer sentiments. And the reason for that, of course, is because there is a lot of concern both by workers, but by the public, the visitors, if you want, indeed, even by people in areas of policy about attitudes of this sector. So those same constraints that we saw about people not wanting to work in this sector or work refusal are themes that we see on sentiments of consumers about whether they want to patronize the sector or what their views are. So we're wanting to get a better handle on those sentiments, just as DC, Destination Canada, has done on travel sentiments, because they track in terms of understanding what kinds of programs might be needed to not only attract workers, but to skill them up and address those kinds of needs. Moving forward, I don't cover every single point here, but tourismrecovery.ca is one of the most important tools we launched in the beginning of August. It is an online site, free access and resources to give businesses a chance to access tools for business recovery. Soon, more will be added to that site, and I'll talk about webinars in a moment, but they are the next thing we launch, free and accessible to businesses to help manage and learn how to use those tools. The consumer confidence I talked a little bit about on sentiments, but it is another pillar of work as we move forward that we're going to start to tackle in a more earnest way. So let me just reflect on a little bit of what some of this looked like, and it will also give you a clue of what further material you may access from our website or to ask our team about through today's chat, or just going to our website and going or sending an email to any one of us. So in April, we produced the 10-point workforce recovery plan. That has been driving a lot of our agenda. It was informed by the 4 quadrants you saw on the previous slide. By June, this translated into a webinar we posted, which was a pre-launch to the tourism recovery website, but also helped go a little deeper with new issues that we've discovered in the interim. Both the report and the webinar are available for download. The 10-point plan included the items on the screen. I will not read them. They have been driving our strategic activities with our partners all along. And I want to put a little plug in here for the Government of Canada to say that without their funding and their support, we would not have been able to act on any of the activities we've been able to do so far. And we really appreciate that support. Moving forward though, although we've been able to tackle a number of these and continue to plug away at those ones with check marks, there are still 4 categories for which we've not been able to do as much as we would like. and they will become themes as we move forward, and I'll speak to some of those at the very end of the presentation. When we launched the free online training, it was available from April 1 through July 31st. That was one of those first initiatives. We had a tremendous take up on this, very delighted to do so. We would have loved to maintain this. Of course, the training is still there, but we ran out of resources to be able to offer it at no cost. If we were able to find resources, we would open this up again. We do get demands and requests for this, but it's really just a resource challenge, unfortunately. We also, of course, have the resource hub that's on our site, as many of you have a similar thing. Ours is curated specifically to matters with the workforce itself. I wanted to show you where you get this labor market information, or including particularly that employment tracker. If you go to the website, you just have to, well, the website itself is tourismrecovery.ca. Of course, there's the French site as well. If you just click on to labor market information, you'll get the list of different options that are part of the research agenda. The very first tab would get you to the tourism employment tracker. A little note here, it includes a tool in there that allows you to manipulate the data and charts. It takes just about 30 seconds to load. So if you're waiting a little bit just to get it loaded, after that it's all very quick. Just a note that you might see something working away before it's on your platform. But that allows you then to sort data and extract it quickly. Also, our newsletter is every second Wednesday, and I'm highlighting this because it's our main vehicle for maintaining information or providing updates or teasers to some of the most current data. And in particular, if you're looking for the research side, look for the little logo or icon that you see here. When you get to that, that's where we keep you up to date with the most recent LMI insights. Tourismrecovery.ca is a website that looks a bit like what you see here. What you'll notice is that it's broken into 5 thematic areas. What's underpinning communications, workforce, budget, marketing, and strategy are tools to help businesses with continuity, recovery, and actually resilience moving forward. This is an evergreen site. We are constantly adding material to it. Of course, it's in both languages, as is all other programming, and with additional tools. The site itself basically contains a number of references to the most current articles and research, but with the checklists that help translate those into actionable items, a to-do list if you like, so that employers can relate to it and start to work with it directly. This will grow as demand grows and as needs grow in terms of the type of content and what topics people want to see in there. We've had requests, for example, on how to help close properties permanently. That will show up in these sites in the near future. And starting in October, which is next week, but in 2 weeks from now, we start running a series of webinars on selected topics from this site. We have 5 already scheduled. Those will be announced in the newsletter. And if the demand grows, we will continue to offer additional webinars on the various content areas. These webinars are directed at employers or owner-operators to help them navigate these kinds of issues. That is all available at no cost. And the site, of course, does include these downloadable checklists, which are quick and easy for people to work with. Again, more will be added as time ensues. Those webinars will also be taped, can be reviewed, and with it a bit of a transcript with still further information. We'd love to hear from you. If you know of needs and want to help us market and promote this, we'd really appreciate it. Finally, with my last minute, I just want to say that there is still more work to be done. I do not have time today to elaborate on the new initiatives that we have just commenced, but they include work around image campaigns and marketing. They include some work with the Canadian Career Development Foundation on a partnership to help us with displaced workers. They include a lot of work we really see as a high priority with labor market planning. These are all derivative of some of the 10-point plan. On behalf of the Board of Directors, I want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. We really appreciate your support. We do hope to hear from you, and we're eager to answer any questions you might have left in the chat, or if you should follow up with us post today's webinar. Finally, you can find us at tourismrecovery.ca. We wish you and your family good health during these uncertain, unprecedented times. Thank you, everyone.